out some midseason grades to determine how these teams have been doing according to our experts. I normally refer to him as Ryan Wilson. Today I'm welcoming in Professor Wilson with the grades today. So Professor Wilson, let's go to school. We're going to start with my favorite division in all of football, of course, the NFC East. And take a look at your grades here, Ryan. The Commanders get an A+ there. My Cowboys get a D, a B for the Giants, and a C for the Eagles. Let's start with the Commanders first because that's positive and it gives me a chance to be prepared for that Cowboys conversation. What have you liked out of the Commanders this year to give them not just an A, Professor Wilson, but an A+?
Haley, you are a true professional because I didn't know we were working together when I gave the Cowboys a D, and you still were able to maintain professionalism as we talked about it. So credit to you. But let's talk about Washington, the Commanders, right now, real quick. Look, I give them an A+, and maybe that's a little over the top, but I love the Marshawn Lattimore trade because it was their biggest need, number one. Emmanuel Forbes, the last remaining first-round pick from the Ron Rivera era, is on the outs there. He didn't play well as a rookie last year. He struggled this year. This allows Benjamin St. Juste to move over to number 2 cornerback when Marshawn's number 1, and then their second-round pick, Mikey Sanderstill, can move to nickelback, where he was outstanding during his Michigan career, and we've seen glimpses of that this year as well. So I love the pick when you couple it with the draft they had back in April. Of course, it starts with Jaden Daniels, but even Brandon Coleman, the left tackle, has gotten some starts, and he's been effective when healthy. As for your Dallas Cowboys, I like the idea of getting better at wide receiver. I'm not sure paying a 4th-round pick for Jonathan Mingo is not overpaying, because we saw both Deontay Johnson and Mike Williams go for a 5th-round pick, and the Cowboys had needed running back, as you know, Haley, and I thought maybe that might be something they would want to kick the tires on. Chuba Hubbard might have been a great option. Now he's signed that long-term deal and well earned, but that's why, and maybe it's a little harsh grading the Cowboys with that D, but that's why I went in that direction with Dallas, and why I was so bullish, if you will, on the Commanders, because the air was pointing up with that team that sits at 7-1.
Listen, I'm with you. I also give them a D this year, even from the beginning of the season, when it took Jerry so long to get those contracts done. So I'm with you. It has certainly been a disaster there for the Cowboys. Let's move on to the NFC North. Taking a look at your grades here, Professor Wilson. The Lions, I love this, A+. The Vikings, who started undefeated, they get a B+ as they've hit, kind of some rocks as the season has gone on. And then the Bears there with a C. The NFC North here is typically one of the stronger conferences, or divisions, I should say, Ryan, in the NFL. Walk us through the grades there, starting with the Lions, getting that A+ grade from you.
Yeah, so the Lions going to get to Zadarius Smith, and my buddy Rick Spiel and I talked about this on the With the First Pick podcast on Tuesday, how effective he can be as an edge rusher, both getting after the passer and also against the run. He still has some juice left, and I think that pickup makes this an A+. Now, Aiden Hutchinson, fingers crossed, can come back once they get to January and perhaps get closer to the Super Bowl, and that's going to be what they need, because then you have a 1-2 punch. Right now, they've struggled to have an effective edge rusher outside of Aiden Hutchinson. Josh Paschal's banged up. James Houston had a big rookie season, hasn't been quite able to put that back together. And I think Zadarius Smith will make things a little easier for Aaron Glenn, the defensive coordinator, on the back end with all those players, Brian Branch and Kirby Joseph and company, to do what they do if you can affect the pass rush up front. So I love that pick. Didn't cost them a whole bunch to do that. And then we're talking about the Chicago Bears. I talked about the Cowboys needing a running back, and they didn't really do anything there. I'm fine with moving on from Khalil Herbert because you have depth with Roschon Johnson and DeAndre Swift, but they needed help with the interior offensive line. I thought they might sniff around and try to make that happen, because Caleb Williams has looked nothing like Caleb Williams from USC, where, by the way, Haley, he spent a lot of time last season running for his life. It feels like he's even more so on the run this year, and the results are he's not playing quite as well as perhaps folks expected, myself included. And when you compare that to what Jaden Daniels is doing, that can cause some concern there. So I wish they had done a little more to bolster that offensive line, because even though they're in last place, they're not out of the mix for making a playoff run. They just got to figure things out up front.
Sure, the Bears currently sitting at 4-4. We'll see how the rest of the season pans out for Caleb Williams. If we go to the NFC South here, Ryan, Professor Wilson, I should say, this is a bit of a head scratcher here, because obviously we all know what the NFC South looks like, but you gave both the Panthers and the Saints a B+ over the Bucs and the Falcons, who have obviously had a better season. My mom's a teacher, Ryan, so I know what goes into grading and giving out those grades. I typically don't push back against teachers, but I'm going to here. Let us know your thought process of those two B+ with those two teams.
All right, Haley, let's see if you're buying what I'm selling here. And here's the thinking. You're exactly right. Tampa Bay and Atlanta are in the mix, and I wish they had done a little more to get better. The other two teams, they're playing for 2025, so I appreciate the fact that they're unloading assets to get draft picks. And in the case of the Saints, they got a 3rd rounder, 4th rounder, and a 6th rounder from the Commanders to look forward to next season. Because let's be real, this team probably, as it's currently constituted, isn't going to make a deep push, which is weird to say because they started 2-0. We were all like, oh, here come the Saints and Derek Carr. It didn't happen. Carolina Panthers, same conversation. I appreciate that they locked up Chuba Hubbard. He's been their best player. But I also appreciate that we don't know what's going to happen with Bryce Young. He was okay last week, and that's a step in the right direction. But who knows what his long-term future is? And if you're gonna stockpile draft picks, this is the time to do it. So they did it here. They did it with the Deontay Johnson trade. I'm all for it. We're looking ahead to 2025. The only concern is when I give these grades, you got to get it right once the draft comes around. Otherwise, I reserve the right to go back and change the grades.
All right. I'm kind of buying. I'm like not fully bought in, but now that you've explained it, I feel better about that and how you broke it down. So thank you, Professor Wilson, for breaking that down for us.
You got it.
Let's go over to the NFC West. The 49ers, the team we're spotlighting here, they get a C, but hopefully things will get better with the return of Christian McCaffrey coming back to practice today. This has been kind of an interesting division this season with the Cardinals being so great, the 49ers dealing with injuries. Ryan, with the C grade there, kind of a two-parter. Why the C, and do you think it gets better if they can pick up some steam with Christian McCaffrey coming back this season?
Right. So the C for Khalil Davis, is because you're just trying to keep your head above water. This isn't a slam dunk like a Von Miller trade, for example, a few years ago, like we saw the Rams pull off. This is okay, we got to hold this thing together with duct tape and chicken wire and hope it works out in terms of the defensive line. We know Javon Hargrave's banged up. Maybe he comes back in January. They've had some other injuries along the defensive line. Malik Collins, Yeturmos Gross-Matos, who plays mostly outside, is also on IR. So this gives you a stopgap, and that's why I gave it a C. But to answer your second question, it's got to get better. And fingers crossed, it starts with Christian McCaffrey getting healthy and getting on the field and doing the things that he does. It doesn't help that you lost Brandon Ayuk and that Deebo Samuel continues to struggle with injuries at times. But you get those guys healthy and you have a chance in a division where right now the Cardinals are in first place, which sounds crazy to say here at the halfway point, but that's where we are. So I applaud the move. It could have been splashier, sure, but you're hoping that these guys get healthy and can contribute. And, of course, C-Mac is where you want to start that conversation.
Well, for my sake, I just hope because the Cowboys are not having a great year that the 49ers also continue to not have a great year, but I know that won't happen because it's not my world. But Professor Wilson joining us to break down the NFC after the trade deadline. Ryan, we always appreciate it. Coming up next, we're going to do the exact same thing with the AFC with a big AFC showdown coming our way on Thursday Night Football. Tyler Sullivan is handing out grades next on HQ. Picture this, the streets of New Orleans lined with Chiefs Nation celebrating another Super Bowl title. That's the fate we're staring at right now if KC continues this dominance. They're the only unbeaten left, so no surprise they're atop the AFC playoff picture. The Bills have been good too, 7-2. The Steelers and Russell Wilson have been good as advertised, but at the bottom there, it's been very interesting in the AFC. We had a chance to hear from Professor Ryan Wilson, so let's bring in our AFC professor, Tyler Sullivan, who's going to hand out some mid-season grades. Tyler, before we get into the specifics, though, I do want to ask you about the state of the NFL right now because we've got 9 teams with just 2 wins. 4 of those teams are in the AFC. What if you just thought about the parity that we've seen in 2024 so far?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, you can kind of parse it in the sense of there's the haves and the have-nots in terms of the quarterbacks, right? Like if you have Patrick Mahomes, you're going to be 8-0. If you don't have Patrick Mahomes and you have, like, let's say Bryce Young in the NFC, you're probably not going to be a good football team. But I think there's a little bit more to that too, right? Obviously, you look at teams across the NFL and you see these teams here that have been struggling. There have been some young quarterbacks. There have been some injured quarterbacks. There have been some kind of bust quarterbacks. If we're talking about Will Levis in Tennessee, he's been injured and a kind of a bust there. So there's a lot there, and it really revolves around the quarterback position, in my opinion. But overall, I feel like we have seen a slow start to begin these seasons, and that's kind of indicative of some of these interesting records as we get to the midway point here. You're kind of shaking your head saying, wow, how is that team 500 or under 500 or over 500? Well, the teams that are struggling, I think a lot of it has to do with a lack of a preseason and lack of real contact during the summer. So those first couple of weeks, their first month, it's a little bit of a feeling out process, which is why I think we're seeing some struggles to the early goings.
Yeah, you're right there in line with what our Pete Prisco has been saying. The preseason they need to hit is what Pete always talks about. So interesting there when it comes to the NFL as a whole. Let's start with the AFC, though, and we're going to start in the AFC West. The Chiefs, the Chargers, and the Broncos all get an A from you. Of course, the class clown being the Raiders, who get an F, and I actually hadn't had the chance to see the F grade given there, so kind of funny. But in terms of those 3 A's, Tyler, what stands out to you about their season so far? Because all 3 have had very different seasons to this point.
And of course, we're grading on a curve, right?
Sure.
You know, we're looking at the Chiefs much different than we're looking at the Denver Broncos going into a given season. The Chiefs, they're 8-0, and they haven't even really been playing that good. That's what's crazy about the Chiefs, in my opinion. Obviously, they're defending back-to-back Super Bowl champions. We expect them to be good. We expect them to be the #1 seed. But just the ceiling that I think that this team has is legitimately a team that can go 17-0 because they're undefeated right now and haven't played good in terms of, you know, Patrick Mahomes has had a rough statistical start to the season, but overall, I look at this team and I really think that they're starting to catch their stride. Obviously, they go into the trade deadline, bring in pass rusher Josh Uche, and of course, the big name DeAndre Hopkins coming in to help this offense. But to me, what we're seeing here is, I think, a blossoming of Patrick Mahomes, kind of becoming Patrick Mahomes. Once again, he scared us there with that injury to his ankle, but as long as he's healthy, I think that this team has an inevitability to them that is very reminiscent to my old Patriots teams up here in New England with Tom Brady and Bill Belichick. It just feels like they find ways to win, and specifically with Patrick Mahomes, you see that on 3rd down. It was apparent the other night when they were playing against the Buccaneers, and throughout this season, he has been dynamite on 3rd down. And to me, I think that they're just scratching the surface. If Mahomes becomes Mahomes, this team is going to be special down the stretch, and why they have an A for the first half.
Yeah, it is just becoming more and more apparent that they are going to be playing in that Super Bowl again. It's almost sickening if you're sick of the Chiefs at this point. Let's go to the AFC North. Tyler, we know this is the most competitive conference in all of the NFL, and sitting right there with the C- is the Bengals, who just continue to make things so difficult. That 0-3 start haunting them, but they've found some momentum, and on top of that, they've got Joe Burrow really working right now. What stood out to you about the Bengals this season, and do you think they find a way to get into the playoffs?
Yeah, you know what? This was the toughest team for me to peg because, you know, I give them a C- because I feel like there have been moments that they look great. There's also been moments where they look bad. And I think that I'm leaning a little bit closer to them kind of being one of those middling bad teams, which is why I go C- as opposed to just C or C+ or B. You're 100% right that Joe Burrow has been playing out of his mind. He threw 5 touchdowns the other week, and it's the 2nd time this season that he's done it. So he's playing at a high level. My question is for the rest of the team. And really, what are the Cincinnati Bengals? Because tonight's going to be a really interesting test. I look at them and say, okay, well, you're 5-4. You're starting to figure it out. Maybe this is, you know, the classic Bengals that struggle at the beginning parts of the season, but all of a sudden come on strong. Tonight's going to be a really interesting test for that kind of hypothesis, right? Because right now, their 4 wins, all of them are coming against terrible teams in the NFL, all under 500. We're talking about the Carolina Panthers, the New York Giants, the Cleveland Browns. They're beating up on bad teams. The teams they've lost against outside of New England in week 1, which was one of the biggest upsets of the year, and it came right out of the gate. But all those teams right now are playoff teams. They're losing to the Philadelphia Eagles, to the Kansas City Chiefs. I kind of just wonder if they're one of those middle teams in the NFL that beats up on bad competition, but can't beat the legitimate contenders. We'll find out tonight as they go up against one of those legitimate contenders in the Baltimore Ravens, but I have my doubts on this team for sure.
Yeah, Joe Burrow, his numbers actually rival what we've seen from Lamar Jackson, who is again in that MVP conversation. So as long as they have Joe Burrow, they are down, but certainly not out. It'll be fun to watch that team down the stretch. Maybe not as fun when we go to the AFC East because, man, what a dumpster fire this season has been in that division. The only team, Tyler, that's really exceeded expectations has been the Bills, who lead the division right now with that reworked offense. But elsewhere, the Dolphins have had injuries. The Patriots, as we talked about before we came up, are not the Patriots of old. But I want to talk to you about the Jets because everybody thought that 2nd year of Aaron Rodgers, and this was the team that was going to go to the promised land. They bring in Devontae Adams, and yet things still haven't worked out here. What is not working for Aaron Rodgers and the Jets out there in New Jersey, Tyler?
Well, you said it right there with the word expectation. we were thinking about this team as a legitimate, Super Bowl contender is maybe a little bit of a stretch, but, some team that could really make waves in the AFC, because on paper, this should be a very good football team. You have Aaron Rodgers that sure is in the twilight of his career, but if you look at past quarterback play from the New York Jets, this is the best quarterback they've had in decades. To go on top of the fact that they have a very good defense on paper, they have an offense, even before they acquired Devontae Adams, you have Garrett Wilson, one of the brightest young wide receivers in the NFL. Breece Hall, one of the best young running backs in the NFL from a talent standpoint. It just has not come together for this team. They can't run the ball. They really just can't do it at all. I think they're the third worst rushing team in the NFL this season. Defensively, Sauce Gardner isn't having a great season, and it just feels like they're off a tick. And, when they acquired Aaron Rodgers, it really kind of felt like a 3-year window. One of those years got erased due to that torn Achilles last year. And now, going into this season, there were questions about Robert Saleh and whether or not he was going to be the guy that could help lead this team to its potential. Ultimately, was fired a month into the season. And so there's going to be kind of questions of why didn't they address that in the offseason to bring in a coach that could get the best out of this roster. And it just seems like they're going to miss their mark. And so there was so much potential here for this team, but they can't run the football. They play undisciplined football. And it just seems like they're going to continue to struggle down the stretch here. They had an impressive, and I use impressive very loosely, win against the Houston Texans. But overall, I think that this team is more of the under 500 team than the team that won last week.
Let me ask you this before we move on. Do you think that this is sort of the trajectory of the Jets, like even into next season too? Because again, we all thought Aaron Rodgers was what was going to be the difference between that first year into now. So are we going to see that go into year 3 with Aaron Rodgers?
Yeah, I think so, because you try to think of what head coaches could come in and be if they take the interim tag off, then fine. Maybe they go down a stretch and they feel like this is kind of an Antonio Pierce situation. They play well under the interim, so they take the tag off. But if you bring in a Mike Vrabel or another name like that, maybe they can get things together. But I just don't know what a then 40+ Aaron Rodgers is looking like in his 3rd season in New York. I just don't know if they're going to actually hit the ceiling that we all thought they were going to when they made that blockbuster with Green Bay.
Yeah, it has certainly just not been what we thought, to your point. So we'll just have to keep an eye on it. The Jets get the Cardinals this weekend, 4:25 on CBS. Let's wrap this up by talking about the AFC South, Tyler, because they're exactly who we expected them to be. As you take a look here at the grades, it reflects that. No team received higher than a B, and that was the Texans, who have struggled in C.J. Stroud's 2nd season. Did the conference really take any strides this season, Tyler? Or is the perception that the football is bad consistently just what we're going to expect out of the AFC for the rest of the season?
There was some hope here, right? I mean, we were all hoping that the AFC South could finally not be the laughingstock of the conference. You have C.J. Stroud coming off that phenomenal rookie season. You have Anthony Richardson, who was a top 5 pick. You have Will Levis, who, they really spent all around him to try to build him up. And then you have the Jacksonville Jaguars, who were another team that spent big in the offseason. It just feels like this entire division has lost its way. And the number one kind of example of that is Jacksonville. You have the ownership going into the season saying this is the best team that they've assembled in franchise history, and they kind of stink. They just flat out are not a good football team right now. You have Trevor Lawrence now banged up. It could be Mac Jones starting this weekend if he's not able to go. And you look at the struggles on offense, and you look at the struggles on defense. This is one of the worst defenses in the NFL. You look at any meaningful statistical margin, and it's either bottom 3 or the flat out worst in the NFL. Just for reference, if you're an opposing offense and you get into the red zone against this Jacksonville defense, you're scoring a touchdown essentially 70% of the time. I don't care if it's Patrick Mahomes and the greatest show on turf on the opposite side. That's a tough thing to ask your quarterback to match week in and week out. So as much as we're probably putting a lot of blame on the offense and Trevor Lawrence, and he hasn't been the number 1 generational type prospect prospect that we were hoping he was coming out of Clemson, and he's now being paid like one of the top quarterbacks in the NFL. This defense is not doing him a lot of favors, and it's gonna get worse before it gets better. You're playing Minnesota this week, and then you're going to Detroit before your bye. Doug Peterson, look out. That hot seat's getting hot.
Yeah, taking a look at the standings currently, the Jags sitting in 14th over there in the AFC. The Titans are the team from that division that are the closest to clinching the playoffs, 3 spots back from the Broncos there. So you laid it out perfectly. The AFC South is who they are. Tyler Sullivan joining us to give out some mid-season grades, which brings us to Sunday as we get week 10, I should say, underway in the NFL. Plenty of action to keep you entertained. Make sure you check out your local listings to see which game is in your area or stream it on Paramount Plus.